The banker John Pierpont Morgan was a titan of America's Gilded Age. He shaped the financial landscape, organizing massive corporate mergers that produced some of the infamous monopolies of the era. And his leadership on Wall Street during the Panic of 1907 rescued the national economy from crisis. JPMorgan is forever associated with New York City, where today the Morgan Library and Museum is a testament to his wealth and passion for art, literature, and history. But J.P. Morgan was born and eventually laid to rest in a much smaller city, 100 miles away, Hartford, Connecticut. The Morgan connection with Hartford began with J.P. Morgan's grandfather, Joseph. Born in 1780, Joseph Morgan grew up on the family farm west of Springfield, Massachusetts, in what's now the city of Holyoke. From the time he was 15, Joseph spent his winters teaching school and the rest of the year on the farm, which he eventually inherited from his father in 1813. But Joseph had ambitions beyond farming. In 1815, he moved to nearby Westfield, where he purchased a stage line and a tavern. Just 2 years later, he moved again to Hartford, Connecticut. In those days, Hartford was a significant trading port on the Connecticut River. The riverfront was lined with wharves, and State Street was the major thoroughfare that led from the docklands westwards to the State House and the city's main street beyond. In November 1816, Joseph Morgan purchased a brick house and barn right along this vital corridor. And in January 1817, he opened Morgan's Exchange Coffee House. Selling his tavern in Westfield to a cousin, Morgan now focused all of his energy on Hartford, where his strong personality and entrepreneurial spirit soon made his establishment the leading social center for the city's most prominent families. Sometimes dances would go on all night long in the tavern's ornately decorated ballroom, which had a special sprung floor. Very much like a modern social club, the Exchange Coffee House became the gathering place of Hartford's business leaders. In this atmosphere of sociability and deal-making, it is perhaps no surprise that the keen businessman and investor Morgan, who would pass his genius for finance down to his son and grandson, would be involved in some notable transactions. He was instrumental in establishing the Aetna Fire Insurance Company, which was organized at his coffee house in June 1819. A decade later, in 1829, the ambitious Morgan sold the coffee house and moved his family and business to Main Street. He leased the 50-room City Hotel, which he operated until his retirement from business in 1835. Joseph Morgan's final move was to Asylum Street, where he built a relatively modest house. Here he lived until he passed away in 1847. His widow, Sarah Spencer Morgan, continued to reside here until her death in 1859. The house was later converted to business use as Hartford's commercial district spread westward. Before it was eventually torn down, the building had become a local landmark because it was here in his grandparents' home that J.P. Morgan was born on April 17th, 1837. But first, let's talk about J.P. Morgan's father, Junius Spencer Morgan. He was born on the family farm back in Massachusetts in 1813. He moved to Hartford with his family, but would return to the farm to work in the summertime during his youth. In 1826, the young Junius was one of the original cadets at Captain Alan Partridge's American Literary, Scientific, and Military Academy in Middletown, Connecticut, which was located on the campus later acquired by Wesleyan University. In 1829, his father sent him to work as a clerk in Boston. Later, after a brief stint at a New York banking house, he returned to Hartford in 1836 with his new bride, Juliet Pierpont, and joined the dry goods firm of Howe, Mather and Company, which later became Mather, Morgan and Company. The young couple had moved into Junius's father's house on Asylum Street. where they lived the first 19 months of their marriage and where their first child, John Pierpont Morgan, was born in 1837. The young family then had a brief stint in a rented house on Church Street before moving west of downtown Hartford. Since his arrival in the city, Junius's father Joseph had purchased many acres of farmland in this area that would later become the city's Asylum Hill neighborhood. Joseph built a house for his son on part of this land at what would later become 108 Farmington Avenue. Long since replaced by a modern bank building, this house was JPMorgan's childhood home until the family moved to Boston in 1851. The young JP, who preferred to be called Pierpont and was called Pip by his friends and family, attended Hartford's West Middle School before moving on to Cheshire Academy and the English High School of Boston. He later studied in Europe. By then, his father Junius had settled in London, where in 1854 he became a partner in the banking house of George Peabody and Company. The firm later became J.S. Morgan and Company under Junius's leadership. Meanwhile, his son, J.P. Morgan, was establishing himself on Wall Street. At the age of 24, he started his own banking house, J. Pierpont Morgan and Company. The Morgans, father and son, would amass great wealth and power in London and New York, but they still maintained connections with Hartford. Junius's sister Lucy had married Major James Goodwin, another entrepreneurial businessman who had come to control all of the stage lines in and out of Hartford. Goodwin erected the now lost mansion that was known as the Goodwin Castle. J.P. Morgan would retain close ties with his Hartford cousins, Major Goodwin's sons, James Junius Goodwin, who joined him in New York as a partner for a time in J.P. Morgan and Company in the 1860s, and his brother, Reverend Francis Goodwin, who was an Episcopal priest and philanthropist who made tremendous contributions to Hartford's landscape through his 30 years of service on the city's Parks Commission. Over the years, J.P. Morgan provided support for many Hartford institutions, including Hartford Hospital, the Watkinson Library, Trinity College, and the Connecticut Historical Society. But the greatest beneficiary of his generosity in the city was the Wadsworth Atheneum, which today is the oldest public art museum in the United States. His father Junius was one of the original corporators named in the institution's 1842 charter. The previous year, Junius had subscribed $100 to the Atheneum's building fund. In 1889, his son J.P. Morgan and nephew Francis Goodwin persuaded him to make a much larger gift, the princely sum of $100,000. Pierpont Morgan himself gave an additional $50,000. Junius Spencer Morgan died after being injured in a carriage accident in Monte Carlo in 1890. In his memory, his son funded a new addition to the Atheneum, the Morgan Memorial, which was dedicated in 1910. An addition to the memorial was still under construction when J. Pierpont Morgan passed away in Rome on March 31, 1913. In 1917, in accordance with his will, his son J.P. Morgan Jr. gave more than 1,350 objects from the vast Morgan art collection to the Wadsworth Atheneum, a gift that would form the core of the museum's European decorative arts collection. Following J.P. Morgan's funeral at St. George's Church in New York, he made his final journey back to Hartford. The procession passed the house on Asylum Street where he had been born 75 years earlier, and then made its way to the Morgan family plot at Cedar Hill Cemetery. The Morgan Monument, completed in 1889, was designed by Hartford architect George Keller. It is said to represent John Pierpont Morgan's vision of the Ark of the Covenant. J.P. Morgan was a dominant figure as a financial giant and eminent collector. He never forgot the city of his birth, where he was finally laid to rest next to his father and grandfather. If you enjoyed this video, you might also enjoy my videos about the Goodwin Castle and also Hartford's lost Vanderbilt Mansion. Please like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.